All right, it is 11:30 here in Chicago. That means it is 9:30 in Sacramento. So we're going to get started. We're here for a walk on the wild side, how to keep up the suspense. This is a panel that they gave us a couple of sample questions and they seemed very writerly. So we're hoping that everyone's here to talk about sort of writerly topic of suspense, see how the sausage gets made maybe. So our panel today is Chris Hauty. I should have asked you how to say that name. Chris.
You did it perfectly.
Yes. Okay. Chris Hauty. I like that name, by the way.
So did my teenage boys when they were teenagers.
I bet. Doesn't hurt, right? Chris Hauty is a playwright and screenwriter. His debut novel is Deep State from Atria, and he lives in California. And Chris, you said you also have a new book coming out in January, and we're going to get to talk about that at the end of today's session as well. Vanessa Lille. Vanessa Lille's debut, Little Voices, was an Amazon bestseller. Her latest thriller is For the Best, as you can see over her shoulder, from Thomas and Mercer, and she lives in Rhode Island. We also have Lee Matthew Goldberg, who is a novelist and screenwriter who's been nominated for the Prix du Polar. Did I say that right?
I don't know.
Nobody knows, right? Okay.
Yeah, sure.
It's very French.
Super French, yeah.
His latest thriller is The Ancestor from Down and Out Books. He lives in New York. We also have Clare Mackintosh. Clare Mackintosh's first book, I Let You Go, won the Theakston's Old Peculiar Crime Novel of the Year in 2016. And her latest thriller is Let Me Lie from Berkeley. She lives in Wales. We're very glad. And this is Chris's first BoucherCon and also Claire's first BoucherCon. So that's kind of exciting, I think. We also have John Vercher. John Vercher's debut novel, 3/5, from Polis, was nominated for the Edgar Award for Best First Novel. Not too shabby, John. Not too shabby. He lives in Pennsylvania. And then we also have Tina Whittle. Tina Whittle's latest in her Tai Tray series is Reckoning and Ruin from Poison Pen Press. She lives in Georgia and has been nominated multiple times for the Georgia Author of the Year. Very cool. And I am Lori Rader-Day, author of The Lucky One from HarperCollins and the immediate past president of Sisters in Crime. So today we're going to talk about suspense. And I think of suspense as the fuel to get to the end of the story, the fuel to get readers to want to know. But it's also baseline sort of a suspension of the attention of the reader. So it's that heightened, tension-filled aspect of a story that we need, but also it's suspending the reader's attention from page to page. So we're going to talk about all sorts of suspense today. I'm going to start us off by talking about when in the planning or the writing of a story, if you don't plan, such as me, when in the process do you start to think about tension and suspense, and what form does that take for you? Who among us wants to be the first to take that on? I think Claire, because Claire has been awake a lot longer than the rest of us.
I love that. We're just going to go in order of who got up first. Brilliant. So for me, the thoughts about suspense start, so I am a plotter. I'm not one of these people that can just fly by the seat of their pants. I need my route map. I need to know where I'm going. And suspense for me starts before I've even started plotting or planning. It starts with the idea, and it starts with the driving question, the big what if question. You know, what if someone you thought was dead turns up alive? What if a child that was missing comes back and, you know, it looks entirely different? It's the what if question, and that question is going to provide that fuel, that suspense that will carry me through the story. So I'll test out an idea before I even start doing any work on it at all, to make sure that it has a sort of an inbuilt suspense.
I'm going to follow-up question, if I may. you said you test it out. Is that an internal process, or is that?
So a little bit internal, in that I will take lots of, that's my favorite bit of being a writer. So that's when I get to take lots of baths and long walks and go for swims and lie on a chaise longue drinking martinis and just mull, you know, take the dogs out, those sorts of things, and just sort of test it out mentally. But I do a 3-act structure on paper, and it's got to be paper. I cannot be doing with Scrivener or any fancy pantsy software. Big bit of wallpaper, paper spread out on the wall or a table, lots of post-it notes, 3-act structure, rising tension like that, so it's going all the way up to a big climax, and I'm sticking my scenes on it. And if I haven't got suspense in this story, then it's not going to go anywhere. That arc isn't going to happen. So yeah, lots of post-it notes, and that's how I'll test it out.
Okay. And then I think Lee, when I asked for a volunteer, I think maybe that you were willing to do it, and I went to Claire. So my apologies, sir.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm a little bit similar. I mean, I always think of a 3-act structure, and I'm a huge plotter. Mostly just because it saves so much time, I think, in the long run. And I think my first book I didn't, and it took me like 10 years to write. So I never want to repeat that, basically. So yeah, I'll do it like chapter by chapter and make sure that each chapter sort of has that structure where there's suspense going on and there's tension going on. And then if it doesn't, how could I fix that and either remove a chapter, add a chapter? But so it's always sort of that rise and fall, kind of like you were saying, Claire. Throughout, and then it's just easier for me. I don't like to sit down and have just like an empty blank screen staring at me. I like to know sort of what I'm doing for that day, so I don't like waste my time. But I'm the same too. I work in Central Park, and sometimes I just sit there and like take in the sun and think about what I'm going to do next, although I have no idea what I'm going to do the next couple months as it gets cold.
Okay. I saw, Vanessa, you were nodding at one point. Are you also a planner extraordinaire?
Well, I'm a reformed pantser too. Now okay. I plot because
you've seen the light.
Well, like Lee, so I wrote 2 books over 10 years, and I did not like that average. Also, they were a mess, hence they're still under the bed. But I have found that structure is a huge part of creating suspense and just making sure your story is moving forward. And, you know, I'll notice as I'm revising, especially, I'll almost feel, you know, some kind of a kick of like, you're reading almost more like a reader and you almost feel bored. You're like, what is happening in this scene? And I often will lean on structure to figure out what's not working, because it can often diagnose, you know, the problems. So I am now officially, you know, a plotter.
So you do all your thinking about suspense ahead of time as well then?
Well, because I am naturally a pantser, I do change a lot while I go, but I make myself stay really focused on kind of the outline that I've created. I also like paper, like Claire, and I keep focused on that so that I'm not taking 5 years on a section that will just live under my bed, which I've done before. And instead I'm really focused on that. But certainly being a pantser, I think, is great because you might have everything plotted out. This has been my experience anyway. I plotted out my whole book. I sat down, I was working on it, and I was like, this is kind of boring. It needs something else. And so I kind of leaned on the pantser side of me to figure out, actually it's for the best, there's a vlog component that I added onto my book, that my main character is recording a vlog to prove herself innocent of murder. And that was not in my outline at all. But as I was writing it, I just was like, this just needs something to up the suspense and the kind of importance of what she's doing. So, you know, you can lean on both skill sets.
I like the concept that pantsing is a disease, I think is what I'm getting, the diagnosis and the reformed. Thank you for that. Tina, are you a pantser or plotter?
No, total pantser.
Okay, hold on a second. John, which are you?
Oh, total pantser.
Okay. Okay.
Oh, okay. John, I thought you and I had something together, and now it's all over.
Now, Chris.
Yeah.
Chris, which are you?
God, I wish I could come up with something that was either or, but you know, I come from a world of screenwriting, and every screenwriter I know outlines like crazy. So
Okay.
definitely not wearing pants.
Okay, so let's go to you then. When in the process are you most concerned about suspense? Is it upfront? Or do you work on it throughout, I guess?
I'm not concerned I'm concerned about people wanting to turn the page and not putting the book down after 10 or 15 pages. I don't know, but Lee probably has experience with this. I don't know which other panelists have come from or had any experience in Hollywood, but people produce, the decision makers in Hollywood don't like to read. So the challenge for any screenwriter is to convince them to read your work. So for the last 3 decades, I've been writing just to get people to turn the page. So, you know, the process is very similar, I think, among all of us who outline. It's laying it out, working from big to small, and just being able to see the whole story and see how, you know, the more you write, the more you develop an intuition for organic, you know, progression of your story. The one thing I'll add to all those statements is that for me, the outlining, excuse me, outlining is creating problems for yourself as a writer. And then the writing process is figuring out the solutions to those problems. How am I going to get my protagonist out of this locked room when their gun is on the other side of the door, or something like that? So in the outline, you're deciding what has to happen. And in the writing, you're figuring out how the hell to do it, if that makes sense.
I mean, that sounds like a hybrid, really.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it would be tragically boring to have it, you know, I have heard of outlines that are, you know, 30, 40, 60 page long outlines or treatments in the film business. And then you just kind of blow it out a little bit to make it your finished work. So yeah, I mean, I don't like, here's that little fella. I don't like outlining so much. It's a bit laborious. The writing, for me, the first draft is always the most fun. It's near euphoric, really a lot of fun.
Okay. All right. So the rest of us are pantsers.
Wow. Stay strong.
Stay strong, my fellow pantsers.
We can help you. Don't worry. All is not lost.
I would, if I could outline, I would do it. All right. I just, it's, yeah. John, talk to me about when you are concerned about suspense. When is it part of your process to think about suspense?
To be perfectly honest, I don't know that I think about it that in depth. For me, what's important in the beginning is character, and then an inciting incident. It's not so much about weaving suspense all the way through. That kind of comes to me as I'm doing it. But if I feel like I know the inciting incident inside and out, and I know the characters inside and out, and how they're going to react to that inciting incident, and where their character is going to take them on that journey, then the suspense sort of comes as I go. And then I also think about it in terms of structure. Like for 3/5, I did it. I had alternating points of view, because novels that I really enjoy reading use alternating points of view to kind of take you up this hill of a roller coaster, and just when you think you're going to come down on the other side, they switch to another point of view and take you up another roller coaster. So it's things like that I use to create suspense, but it's, if anything, that comes much later, not at the beginning for me. I don't know if that makes sense.
It makes total sense to me. I think all the plotters are like, it just comes. Okay. Ina.
Yeah.
Also a pantser, it appears. When do you think about suspense? When are you worried about suspense and tension?
Well, I am a reformed wannabe plotter.
Oh.
I tried really hard to learn to be a plotter, but my brain just doesn't work that way. So I discovered the secret I used to teach when I taught freshman composition, which is I made my students do an outline, but I told them they didn't have to do the outline at the beginning. They could do the outline at the end. So I used Scrivener, which saved me, because that allows me to be my pantsy self and to make all of these little stories and scenes, whatever strikes me at the moment, and then start putting them together into a coherent narrative. And it creates over on the left-hand side an outline for me that I can then follow and check everything out. So yeah, I'm a hybrid, except I do the outlining at the end.
Okay, that makes sense to me. I do an outline as I write, and then yeah. Okay. So one of the things I was hearing was sort of like this diagnostic aspect of it. So no matter how we've written, no matter how we thought about suspense, there's a possibility that we get to a certain part of the story and realize we don't have enough tension. What sort of methods might you try to make sure that you are injecting suspense into your story at that point? Vanessa?
Kind of easy. And I probably took it from a workshop and I just can't remember, but it's sort of like a choose your own adventure style when I'm in a scene and it's either like falling flat or I just need to up the tension, and I just look at my characters and look at the situation, and then I'll do 10, sometimes 20 things that could happen in the scene. And with each thing, I try to push myself a little further until it's like completely crazy, like the world explodes. But, you know, somewhere between that and where I actually am, I usually can find something to really ratchet up the tension. So it's sort of choose your own adventure / just push yourself to make these lists and see how far you can kind of take the scene.
It's often about raising the stakes, isn't it? Like going back to what John said about being character-led, because ultimately you can have the most exciting plot in the world, but actually if readers don't care about the characters, it's not going to pull them through. So if you know your characters, then you know how to press their buttons and how to raise the stakes. So I think it's about looking at what really matters to that character at that particular moment, and how can you make that life more difficult for him? What challenges can you put in her path that gets between where they are now and the thing that they desperately need or want?
Does anybody want to add
to Claire's? Just to piggyback on what Claire is saying, there's a great quote. I think it's kind of attributed to a bunch of different authors, but I think the one I've seen it the most with is Vonnegut. But he says, drive your characters up a tree and then throw rocks at them to see how they react and how they get out of the tree. I mean, I think that's how that is one of the best ways to build some of that suspense, is really find out what motivates them and how they're going to get out of that situation.
I think define anticipation too. You know, if your reader thinks they know what's going to happen and that doesn't happen, they become, it's tense. So always surprising, and define expectations and anticipations. Twists are great methods of creating tension, I think.
And sometimes it's quite a small change as well, I think. Like I'll do a linguistic edit where actually the tension is all about the fact that maybe I've just got a chapter where all the sentences are just kind of the same. I've got the same rhythm, and actually what I need to do is go through and just break that up, shorter paragraphs, shorter sentences, you know, contrast between long and short. So it's not actually about the story or the characters or the challenges at all. It's simply about the prose or the imagery, or, you know, bringing in some tension from weather. It can be actually quite a simple change.
That's really a good point. The language, the prose has a lot to do with it. And I always try to come up with, you know, you can overdo it like everything in writing, it's all a matter of touch. But if you can even surprise your reader with the language that you use, or throwing in some aspect, some observation from left field, it just keeps things lively and punchy in the read, which I think propels the story forward.
Sometimes I'll just
something to be
like a character's not working, they're boring, they're flat on the page, maybe it's time for them to go, and that kind of continues the tension, kind of connected to that too.
time to go.
Time to go.
Like second body problem. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And you may love them and they may be a great character, but they're just not working, and then their point becomes maybe their death or how it happened and all of that.
Do any of you write your novels just from one point of view? Because I know that I lean quite heavily when I'm thinking about suspense on that ability to cut from one character to another. So I've got these sort of mini cliffhangers. And I've never written a novel that's just one character perspective, because actually I'd be quite worried that I couldn't cut away. Do you all write multi POVs, or do any of you just have one POV?
Just one.
Do you? So Tina,
yeah.
how do you, so you can't just cut away?
Mm-mm.
Is
I
that
write first person point of view, so it's really close, and everything has to be filtered through my protagonist perspective. Yeah, so it does get really.
I cut away occasionally to be characters, but most of it is from my protagonist's point of view. What about tense? I write in the present tense, and some readers object, but it's what I'm used to after 3 decades writing screenplays. And I like it. I think it increases I think it increases the sense of immediacy and tension. But does anyone else write in present tense?
I do both. It depends on the book, but yeah, I think it's a natural progression from screenplays, so it works that way, and it does kind of bring you right into the story.
Yeah, I made one mistake. I made more than one mistake. I've written 3 books now. Deep State is my debut, which came out in January this January, and I made a few mistakes. But speaking of screenwriterly habits, in one place in this, I get going writing. I'm writing the prose, but I said "we see," which is something you do in screenplays. We see Joe walk into the room and fall down dead on his face, and the we see, and one reader on Goodreads or something brought that up, and I like, oh my God, no one else saw that. So I had it cleaned up in the ebook.
John, earlier, I think there was a moment where you wanted to say something. I didn't want to move on until you had a chance.
Yeah, I think we might have moved away from it a little bit, but one of the other elements that I think that helps to add suspense is letting the reader in on things that you don't let your character in on. Mm-hmm. Giving the reader all the information that your character doesn't have, knowing that, they shouldn't go around that corner, but they're probably going to do it anyway. I think is a really subtle way to do that. It's in books that I enjoy reading. That's a strategy that authors use that I really enjoy.
And actually, that's really perceptive, because isn't that exactly what suspense boils down to? Is who knows more than someone else? So whether it's that example that you've just given of the reader knowing more than other characters, or it's one character that knows more than another, it's always about the balance of knowledge. So maybe that's a place, if there are people watching today who are writers and wondering how to put tension and suspense in their novels, maybe that's a place to go and look, is who knows what at any one point, and is there enough of a balance between the amount of knowledge that each character has.
I normally call that narrative irony. I don't know if that's how you guys understand it, but that level of and sometimes it's through the other character, right? If you have 2 points of view character, one knows something, one doesn't. That's really fun for the readers. We touched a little bit on character. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Character as a suspense tool. I teach a little bit in one of the sessions I do about suspense. My top tool for suspense is a character that people want to spend time with, either because they're interesting or they like them, but not necessarily have to be likable. What do you think about character as just that suspending the attention from page to page, not even tension exactly, but just getting the reader to turn the page? Nobody?
Well, I can jump in. So I've written 2 books, and they're both first person present tense. And they're kind of more of the psychological thriller vein of crime fiction. And I do think that, to me, the character piece, the likable thing is really interesting, because my last book, my main character, a lot of people find her very unlikable, which is fine. That's appropriate for all the things she goes through. But I think this idea of what makes a person want to follow a character and find out the truth, find out what really happened. And sometimes it's likability for sure. You know, like the premise of actually screenwriting, like Save the Cat, like a character who's like very heroic. But then there's also, you know, if they're an interesting character, like you think of a Gone Girl or something, this idea that, you know, they draw you in and then they end up being so crazy, but you just can't kind of turn away. And I think that's great about this genre, is that we're able to write characters who really, I think, push readers' expectations about character, and you just kind of have to know what they're going to do next or how involved they were really in the crime. And character, even especially like in first person, I enjoy kind of pulling those levers creatively and writing in that way, because it is such a, it's such a closed perspective that you have a really good sense of everything the reader is seeing. And so you can kind of figure out with character how to create those suspenseful elements and how much to tell, what not to tell. So I've really enjoyed it. And I admire people who do multiple points of view, because I think that would be very difficult. For me now, that's first person, like in the moment.
Anybody else?
Most of my characters are somewhat unlikable, and I kind of enjoy writing anti-heroes. But along with that, you have to give them some type of empathy. It's kind of like what you were saying, Vanessa, like the Save the Cat. Like, they're terrible, but they have a cat, and like then the reader can connect to the cat, and so they follow them in that way. But what I love about thrillers, I've written in other genres, and in other genres, you really have to write more likable characters. Like a literary novel, like it's very hard to sell and for readers to get invested if they're not. But what I love about thrillers is you really have the opportunity to kind of create anything, and you could create just a detestable character, and people want to turn the page because maybe they want something bad to happen to that detestable character. So that's going to keep them kind of moving forward. And I think with thrillers, it gives you just so much more freedom to kind of create any kind of character that you want to. And that's why I think I veer more towards that.
I tend to be drawn to reading characters who are supposed to be unlikable, but you can't help but like them anyway, or at least understand them. You know, villains to me done right are the ones that are sort of the heroes of their own story. They don't really believe that they're doing anything wrong. Because I think that makes for a better reading experience too, because it in some ways holds up an uncomfortable mirror to the reader, that maybe they see a little bit of themselves in that character, and that's why they want to turn the page to see, are they going to react in the way I think I would react? So in that sense, I think character is hugely important in creating that tension on the page.
And I'm seeing some of the chat questions asking about unreliable narrators and the point of view that you cannot trust. And I really think all of us write unreliable narrators. We're all writing people who are so grounded in their own perspective and their own biases that there may be things that they miss and don't know, which I think also works again with that, the reader knowing things your character doesn't know. It's a kind of a tightrope between your character seeing something and reacting to it within their bubble of perspective, but the reader going, oh, she's not seeing everything, and using your secondary characters to kind of reinforce that there's something going on that my character can't see, but you, smart reader, absolutely can.
I was a police officer for a long time before I was a full-time writer. And I often, when I'm building characters, I often think back to all the people that I've sat in an interview room with. And I don't think in all the years that I did that I ever spoke to a criminal who didn't have some redeeming features. And I don't think I ever spoke to a victim of crime who didn't have some flaws or wasn't hiding something from me, or, you know, distorting the truth slightly. And so I try and keep that in mind all the time and make sure that my characters are multifaceted, and that in itself will keep that suspense and keep the reader turning the pages.
great.
My experience with all of this, it makes me think about reading Don Winslow's books. And I love his books, but I love some more than others. I read Broken and was absolutely blown away by that book. And then I loved it so much and loved the characters so much. And then I picked up The Forest, which everyone said, you got to read The Forest. If you like Don Winslow, you got to read The Forest. And I started, and I put it aside after 20 or 30 pages. And so that made me think as a writer, like, why the hell was that? And, you know, I guess I love a deliciously evil character, but for me, I think it's every character in the book, in the story, needs to have sympathetic qualities that make them, that round them out and make them more relatable. And I guess that's why I reacted to Winslow's book in the way that I did. It's just like in the characters in Broken were just seemed so real, like they just walk through the door and they're sitting down in that chair and hanging out and having a beer. So that's what I always, you know, strive. That's the ambition as a writer, is to be able to write characters that really live with a reader when they read the book, for me.
Okay, another method for suspense might be time constraints. So I have this quote from Lee Child. He wrote for the New York Times an article about creating suspense. So he says that creating suspense is like, or asking how you create suspense is like asking how you bake a cake. But it's really much simpler than that. He says, how do you bake a cake has the wrong structure. It's too indirect. The right structure and the right question is, how do you make your family hungry? And the answer is, you make them wait 4 hours for dinner. As novelists, we should ask or imply a question at the beginning of the story, and then we should delay the answer. What do you think about Lee? He's not watching. We can say whatever we want. Nobody tell Lee.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great advice. It's like, leave the reader dangling. How it's a perfect way to get them keeping turning the pages. I mean, you want to give them something. You don't want them to feel like, you know, the pages are going by for naught. But yeah, I've never thought about it that way. But I would consider that for future novels, definitely. I always listen to another Lee too, so it's like,
I mean,
yeah.
I think crime and the thriller genre have a lot in common with comedy writing, with joke writing, in terms of making people wait for that punchline. You know, a lot of comedy is building up to the joke, isn't it? And the anticipation of it, and just delaying the moment where you wrap everything up. And that's what we're doing. We're just doing it over 120,000 words, and possibly with a bit more blood than your average comedy gig. But that sort of timing is what it's all about, isn't it? So yeah, make them wait, keep them hungry.
And then also there's the possibility of having a time constraint within your story, right? The ticking clock going on.
I've just finished writing a novel that won't be out till next year, called Hostage, which is set on a long haul flight, and it was the easiest thriller I've ever written, purely because I had nowhere else to go. I only had 20 hours because that's how long the flight was, and so that was my kind of inbuilt suspense, was every hour that passed. That was, you know, the framework of my story. Sadly, I don't think I can write every book based on a long haul flight from London to Sydney, but I might give it a go.
Wow.
I was interested to hear that other panelists were operating in a 3-act structure. I mean, that was something, obviously, as a screenwriter, that I was chained to for so long. Excuse me, but funny, since I started writing novels, I don't think about a 3-act structure at all. I just, you know, look at the story and the characters and just kind of let it roll. So, is that do the other panelists, do you also think of the classic 3-act structure? First act being, you know, a quarter, last act a quarter, in the middle, the act 2/4, a half.
One of my favorite, for any writers out there, one of my favorite books is based off of Save the Cat screenwriting book, but it's actually been adapted for the novel. So it's Save the Cat Writes a Novel by Jessica Brody. And it's an awesome book where she takes the 3-act structure used in screenwriting, but really applies it to books, you know. So, you know, like Girl on the Train is one of the books she uses as an example. And she uses not just thrillers, but all kinds of examples. And because I think structure is really where you find the power of being a storyteller. That's, you know, where you're, because if you're not putting the midpoint in the right place, if you're not putting the twists and turns in the right place and the act breaks in the right place, readers instinctively can feel it, because we watch movies, we read TV. When something's not working, like, you know it, even just like on a gut level. So I think the structure for a writer, from a novel writing perspective, is probably almost just as important as for screenwriters, just because, you know, even though it is a longer amount of words and text, it has to be hitting the exact same, you know, breaks and turns and points, or it's just not going to feel right or move along in a way that is sustainable.
Well, someone in the audience said perhaps the 3-act is ingrained in my subconscious, and that's probably true after writing probably 35 screenplays. But I guess what I'm talking about, you know, when I would outline a screenplay and then write it, that second plot point, at least in the older days, had to happen on page 89, 88. I mean, it was that formulaic. So I think in writing my books, I do feel I'm experiencing a lot, not only more real estate to work with and words that go margin to margin, which are both great things, but also not feeling like, you know, the whammy has to happen here every, you know, 3 pages, and first act plot point happens on page 28 or 30 and the second on 90. So, but yeah, I think
it's formulaic as that, though.
Excuse me?
I don't think it's as formulaic as that, though. And I think that actually the 3-act structure, such as it is something that we as storytellers naturally default to. And although there are great books and they split it down into, you know, heroes' quests and all sorts of things that I can't cope with, actually, when you're a kid, you get taught how to write your stories with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that's all we do now as novelists. We set up a great beginning and we sort the middle out, and then we, you know, give a phenomenal ending. So I'm quite conscious that if I was watching this as an aspiring author, I might be a bit intimidated by the idea that I might need all this technical knowledge about structure. And actually, I think we have to trust our instincts as storytellers, and just kind of, you know, go with the flow a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's what I was.
See, she's a pantser.
I say that as a plotter.
That's what you sound like, Claire.
As a plotter, I'm going to show you. I could show you my plan.
Oh, your wall.
I don't know.
Yeah, no.
Look,
You get the heart of a pantser, Claire.
I'm going to turn you around.
Here we go.
Oh, I'm
Okay,
sure.
hang on.
Sure you've got
See
it.
that?
I-
See my post-it
Okay.
note?
Yeah.
What I'm really impressed
I think all the
by is
pantsers
that
are
light
hiding their
box.
outlines underneath.
I like
them.
Whatever you have to do to feel better about yourself.
That's right.
That's fine.
Okay, one more question, I think, from me, and then we'll go to the audience for some questions. So I was thinking about what ruins suspense? What in a story ruins suspense for you? And there's a quote from Alfred Hitchcock that I sometimes will use in the class I was talking about earlier. I use it in the section where I talk about sex and violence. So he says, "There is no terror in the bang, only in the anticipation of it." And I think it works for both parts of that topic. The bang. Is there something that you think ruins suspense in a story?
I just finished a book. I'm not going to say the author or
Please
the book.
Is it mine? Don't say it. No. Okay.
And this book was good, and you know, I was with it, and then they just were throwing everything like at the wall. was like, this character went crazy and this character went this way. And it just became so incredulous that I like threw it across the room. I was just like, I can't anymore. And then I didn't care who the killer was, who did it anymore. So it was like, they almost felt like maybe that there wasn't enough tension going on. So they had to throw a million other things. So for me, sometimes it's like, just tell like a nice, clean story and you don't have to throw a million bells and whistles. Sometimes those bells and whistles wind up ruining the suspense and tension.
Okay. Tina, what about you? Anything that you think?
Well, I'm thinking back to when we were talking about Lee Child's idea of being hungry. And I saw one of the chat questions was, how do you keep people hungry for a whole novel? And that goes back to the structure too, of you can't just take your entree and your dessert and your appetizer and dump it on people all at the same time. A well-planned meal after 4 hours follows a plan. It keeps people a little bit hungry, and then it feeds them a little bit, and then a little bit hungry for something else, and then feeds them a little bit. So that trying to dump everything at once will absolutely kill suspense. But also starving people for 4 hours will do it too, because there's no payoff there. You get bored and leave and find a better table. So just being able to piece out the reward and know that there's always something else coming, I think is the key to doing it.
Okay. John, what about you? Is there something about story that just kills the story for you?
I think they took all the good answers, honestly. I'm really with Lee when I think, and somebody said it in the chat as well, that when you, I believe it's Russell, said that just over complexity, you know, it's keep it simple, you know, and to Tina's point, dole it out and just give me a little bit more, just a little more line to pull me along. And if you throw the whole ball of twine at me, then it's just a little too much.
Okay.
I think you have to also be clear, and so people understand. I mean, a lot of times I'll be reading a book and I just don't know what the hell is supposed to be happening. So I try to make the prose as clear and understandable as possible. You know, that the filmic analogy would be just too many quick cuts. It's like, what the hell's going on in this scene? It's too darkly lit. And so you have to, the reader has to understand what the action is, what the emotions are, what the characters are doing, what they look like. So super clear prose and super visual is what I tried to do.
I hate a lazy prologue. That's my bugbear. That will kill suspense for me. And I love a prologue if it's done well and it's enticing and it's that, you know, it's Tina's appetizer that she's brought round on a tray. But if it's just a chapter that's been lifted from further on in the book and the author has put it at the front just so that we know something exciting is going to happen, and then as soon as you're through the prologue, actually it's really, really boring. That's just laziness, you know. That story has got to start off exciting. You can't just pull a scene out and stick it in as a prologue.
All the authors in the entire event are like, oh, did I do that?
They're not. They're
I've
looking
done
at
that
my
3
book
times.
now going, well, hang on a minute, you've got a prologue there.
I love a prologue, but I agree. If it's useful, if it's doing some good work for the story, that's okay.
I love a prologue. I always put a prologue in.
One of the things I was thinking about when the ruining of suspense is, well, the sex and violence, right? The sex on the page and the violence, like it's the anticipation of something that is intriguing, and then the payoff coming at the wrong time is possibly not the right decision. I'm just thinking of some of the TV shows where the will they or won't they is confirmed, they will. And then after that, the show is pretty much dead to me. I think we have do we have some questions in the audience? Go ahead and put them in the chat and we will get those answered. Okay. Let me go back to my notes real quick. So while we're waiting for some questions from the audience, what advice would you give to writers struggling with suspense in their story? What's your #1 tip for suspense for the writers in the audience who want to be authors?
I would say make sure you're not, and I've done this, you kind of fall in love with your characters and you love them so much that you don't like to torture them as much as they need to be tortured. So if the suspense isn't there, it might be that you're protecting them more than you should. So read with an eye of, could it get a little worse? And usually it probably can.
That's great, because we're often making it a little bit autobiographical. Yeah, especially that early book, right? Oh yeah. Okay, anybody else have a?
I think my tip would be to look through your draft and look at where you think you've got some suspense, and just really check that what you've got is suspense and not shock, because shock and suspense come from two different sides. So you mentioned earlier, Laurie, the bang, the bang of a gun, if it comes out of nowhere, is still a perfectly valid, exciting thing to have in a novel, but that's your shock. Your build up, the anticipation to the gun or the explosion happening is your suspense. And sometimes it can be easy to write shock when actually suspense would have more dramatic effect. And so, that's a good exercise to go through when you're editing.
Awesome.
Stephen King always said something that's really cool that I go back to, and that's as he's writing, as he's getting towards the bottom of the page, he ramps the suspense and tension up. And even if you're not doing that literally every page, I think just to kind of keep that in mind so they want to turn the page, I found has helped me a ton.
All right, I'm going to look for questions. Okay. Can you overdo twists and surprises? Yes. That is an easy one to answer. And I think, Tina, you were saying kind of dumping them all at once is also a problem. Maybe it's not a matter of having too many, but having too many at once. I'm trying to find the chat. Oh, here's some questions. Okay. How do you know what you're doing hasn't been done before?
It probably has.
Yeah. It's impossible to do anything new.
What is 6 actual plots, and they've just been recycled over and over and over again? Yeah, I mean, I think if you literally take the exact same plot as something, that's not great. But so many books are quite similar. Yeah, I wouldn't worry about that too much.
Yeah, don't let that stop.
So it's in the delivery, right? It's there aren't that many plots, but it's in your style that you can.
Yeah, and it's setting. You've got 4 things, haven't you? You've got the plot itself, you've got setting, you've got characters, and then you've got your execution of it. And actually, as long as one or more of those things is different, then you've got an original product.
That's right. It has to be 20% different, right? Isn't that how the music sampling works? 20% different. Has the pandemic affected how you write or what you write? Timely question.
Well, it hasn't changed anything about how I write. My routine is exactly the same. So I think all of us were probably pre-built for pandemic living. I've been able to, I'm polishing the first draft of the 3rd book in the series, and it will occur after, hopefully, the pandemic, and it definitely changed aspects of the story. It's set in West Texas, and when I started outlining the book, oil prices were up here, and now oil prices are down there. So that definitely changes the boomtown to the bus town aspect of the story. So, you got to work it into your plots and your characters and move on.
Anybody else want to?
I've really struggled to write. I've hardly written at all this year. The first part of the year, I had 3 children at home. I was homeschooling. I couldn't stop doom scrolling and reading the news and saying things to my husband like, have you seen the death count today? And I just couldn't. And now things are still pretty horrific around the world. I normally spend a lot of my year traveling. I'm on the road, either in the UK or in different countries, doing events. And I hadn't realized how much those events feed me. You know, the inspiration of meeting different people, the buzz from being with other writers, from meeting readers, from signing books. I feel like my creative well is empty this year. So I don't mind admitting that I'm finding it really tough.
And that's why you should go to BoucherCon in person when you can, because it's a well-filling enterprise.
Yes.
I felt I had to get through it. I had to deal with it before I could move on. So I wrote a little short story. I did a riff on the locked room mystery, where instead of the crime taking place in the locked room, I had the solving of it take place in the locked room, where my protagonists couldn't leave because they were in quarantine. And that helped me deal with it as a person and to deal with it with my characters. But then I had to move beyond it, because I don't think anybody's going to want to read about this when we're all done with it. I think we're going to want to put it behind us as well.
All right, we get a couple more questions about suspense. So how do you balance suspense with recovery beats? How often should readers get to catch their breath? Seems like a good question.
That's a good question.
Does anybody have an answer?
I mean, this is maybe a little bit of a cop-out, but it's, I think worry about that a bit more in the editing process, and particularly as you have your editor hat on and you're reading your story. If you find that the exciting parts are almost reading like non-exciting parts because there are so many of them, then it probably means you need to put in a breath or two. And you know, because the thing about suspense and the excitement is it really is only the lead up often that makes it worth it. And so if you're not kind of putting in space for character development and to build those things, I think you'll feel it when you're reading it and when you're editing it. And, you know, you could try to kind of plot it, but I think it will be easier on the back end because you'll have more of an instinctual, like, oh, this is too much kind of feeling.
Sometimes I use humor as a break. Like that winds up being just a good way to, for yourself, if you're writing something very, very serious and heavy, and for the reader as well, like just so they get like a minute off of, you know, the craziness of whatever it is you're working on.
One more question, and then I have one more question for you at the end. Who are your favorite writers who master suspense? Who do we think our aspiring writers and readers should be reading?
Ruth Ware for me. She's my go-to suspense, you know, really, really strong suspense writer, pulls you right through the book.
I really enjoyed the Lou Berney's book last year, November Road. I thought that was a great character-driven suspense book.
I just finished Black Hawk Wasteland by S.A. Cosby, and there's a lot of big, exciting kind of, I guess you call them set pieces in that, but the character was still front and center. That was a really great book with good suspense and great characterization.
Becca Locke's Highway 59 for sure. Rich characterization, but also a good deal of, I feel like, slow burn suspense that I really enjoy.
I just read, it's not 100% like a thriller, but I love the author Matt Haig. He just wrote The Midnight Library, which is getting like a ton of buzz. And I read it in a day, which like never happens. So I recommend that.
Okay. And that, you know, can I just say really quickly, Lee, I think that's such a good point, that it's easy for us as thriller writers to think, well, where, you know, we can learn suspense from other crime writers, but actually reading outside of our genre can teach us so much about suspense.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay, and then I want to hear about what everyone is working on, a little bit about their current book, and then what you're working on. Vanessa, can you tell us a little bit about For the Best?
Yeah, so For the Best is the story of a woman who seemingly has everything, but she also has a pretty serious alcohol addiction. And so the story opens with her being brutally hungover the night after a big work event. She was blackout drunk, and there's a police officer at her door with her wallet in an evidence bag found next to the body of someone, and she's now the only suspect in the murder. So she starts a true crime vlog to prove herself innocent of the crime, and has to uncover not only some secrets associated with the murder, but also a lot of her own troubled past. And it's set in Providence, Rhode Island, where I live, and all based on kind of real places, and it was a lot of fun to write. And then I just finished my third book, which is set in rural Oklahoma, where I'm from, and we'll see how that goes too.
Okay, Lee?
My new book, The Ancestor, just came out. And it's about a man who wakes up in the Alaskan wilderness with amnesia, and he sees this other man hunting nearby, and they look exactly alike. Follows that man home, sees the man's wife and child, and it brings a flood of memories of his own wife and child, except they're from the Alaskan gold rush era. And if that's the case, it means he's been frozen in time, and he sort of insidiously tries to insert himself into the family. And then I just finished a new book called The Great Gimmelmans, and it's about kind of a wacky family in the 1980s who lose all their money in the stock market and become bank robbers.
Cool. I love that title.
Thank you.
Tina, what's new and what's coming up for you?
I'm working on the 7th book in the series, Crooked Ways, in which it transitions from an amateur sleuth series into a PI series. So that's what I'm doing. I'm also doing a new series that I'm just experimenting with set here in Savannah.
Very cool. John, what are you working on now? You've got 3/5 that's out. Tell us a little bit about 3/5, and then what are you working on next?
Oh, okay. Yeah, it actually just released in the UK too, which was really exciting. 3/5 is about a biracial Black man who's been passing for white his entire life, and grew up with a bigoted maternal grandfather. And when his best friend is released from prison, he comes out a newly radicalized white supremacist. And the night of their reunion, they get involved in a hate crime. And so over the next couple of days, he's reconciling his past with his current predicament and seeing if there's a way out of that situation. So that's that book. A nice light read. And then my second book is out on submission, so fingers crossed. It's tentatively titled After the Lights Go Out. It's about an aging mixed martial arts fighter who is losing his battle with pugilistic dementia while caring for his father, who's dying of Alzheimer's. And as he deals with this process, he's both trying to keep his career afloat and also deal with some revelations of his family's past that are tough to deal with.
Claire, what's new and what's coming up for you?
So what's out right now is my third thriller, Let Me Lie, which is out in paperback, which is about Anna, whose parents both committed suicide within 12 months of each other in copycat suicide methods. And we join Anna on the anniversary of her mum's suicide when she receives a note which suggests that all is not quite as it seems. So she looks into their deaths and embarks on a murder investigation. What is next is the thriller I referred to earlier, set on an aeroplane, which was huge fun to write. So that's called Hostage. And it's about a flight attendant, Mina, who's on the first ever non-stop flight from London to Sydney. It's 20 hours. And she is presented early on in that flight with an ultimatum that puts the entire plane at risk, and she's got 20 hours to make a decision and save either the plane or a person very, very close to her.
Wow. Chris, what's new and what's coming up for you?
New, I think is new. I mean, it seems like a million years ago. Deep State came out in January. Before everything went crazy. Deep State is about a White House intern, female intern, Army veteran, 25 years old, and just by those characteristics, a bit of an outsider, an underdog in comparison to the other interns in the White House, in the West Wing. And her name is Haley Chill, and she uncovers evidence of a conspiracy by the deep state against the president. And nothing is as it seems from that description, and it follows her efforts, mostly unaided, to make things right. And the next book in that series comes out in January, a year later, this coming January, Savage Road. Very much picks up where the first book dramatically leaves off, and continues a bit of that story that's set up in book one, and also explores a new threat to the country, while she's also uncovering some very dramatic secrets about her own family's life.
Okay, we are out of time. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to BoucherCon and all the volunteers who put this on against all odds. Remember to buy the panelists' books from your independent bookstores. Independent bookstores are the lifeblood of publishing, and we need to support them. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your BoucherCon, everybody.
Thank you, Lori.
Thanks so much, Laurie. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks everybody. Great to meet you all.
Zoom wave.
Yeah.
That's right. This is the new thing we have to do. We have to wave when we're saying goodbye and hello to people.